In the middle of Hollywood, just after midnight, a ride-share driver did something you almost never hear about in Los Angeles. He ran. Not because of a crash, not because of a robbery, but because the man in the back seat, an A-list face the world has trusted on screen for decades, was allegedly threatening him. And the fear in that moment felt real enough to abandon the car and sprint into the night. Police reports say the actor was arrested on suspicion of making criminal threats after an alleged altercation near Sunset Boulevard and Fairfax Avenue, later posting a $50,000 bond as the case moved toward court. But the unsettling part isn't the headline itself, it's how familiar it feels. Because this wasn't the first time the public saw the mask slip. Years ago, Hollywood watched a wedding collapse just 3 days before the vows, one of the most anticipated celebrity ceremonies of the early 90s, then watched the story twist into a tabloid love triangle that never truly stopped haunting his name. And long before the wedding drama, there were the arrests, the late-night stops, the repeated DUI cases that kept returning decade after decade like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. Then came the Met Gala afterparty, high fashion, camera flashes, and a sudden burst of violence so unexpected it stunned the room. Witnesses said a designer was headbutted, blood drawn, and the story spread before the sun came up. So what are we really looking at here? A man who keeps getting unlucky? Or a pattern, quiet, escalating, and ignored because fame makes people look away? If you've only seen him as the hero on screen, this story is going to feel like a different movie entirely. Kiefer Sutherland entered the world on December 21, 1966, in London. From the very beginning, his life was never going to be ordinary. He was born between countries, between cultures, and into a family whose name already carried historical weight. His father, Donald Sutherland, was not just famous, he was formidable. A towering presence in cinema, respected for his intensity, discipline, and gravitas. Donald Sutherland represented a kind of authority that did not seek attention but commanded it. To be his son meant growing up under a shadow that stretched far beyond Hollywood. Yet, the pressure did not stop there. On his mother's side stood an even larger, more abstract legacy. His grandfather, Tommy Douglas, was one of the most influential political figures in Canadian history, the architect of the country's universal healthcare system. Tommy Douglas was remembered not for fame, but for moral conviction. He was associated with reform, sacrifice, and the belief that one individual could reshape a nation. This meant Kiefer Sutherland was born not only into celebrity, but into expectation. Expectation to be meaningful, expectation to matter, expectation to live up to something already written long before he could choose his own path. Hollywood often romanticizes this kind of lineage, a perfect blend of artistic power and ethical legacy. But what rarely gets asked is a simpler question. What does that do to a child? Even his full name reflected the burden. Long, formal, almost ceremonial. It sounded less like the name of a boy and more like a title that had to be earned. Before he ever stepped onto a film set, Kiefer was already defined by who he belonged to and what he was supposed to represent. While the world saw privilege, what existed underneath was pressure. Pressure to succeed without failing. Pressure to be strong without breaking. Pressure to honor a legacy he never asked to inherit. And legacies, when they are this large, do not simply inspire, they compress. They leave little room for vulnerability, confusion, or mistakes. They demand greatness before a person has even discovered who they are. Kiefer Sutherland did not grow up trying to become someone famous. He grew up trying to become enough. Hollywood would later celebrate the fire, the intensity, the edge in his performances. But that fire did not come from nowhere. It was forged early, inside a life where identity was already scripted and deviation felt like failure. And while fame would eventually give him a voice, it would also give him nowhere to hide. Because when you were born into a dynasty, escape is never simple. Sometimes the only way out is through destruction. of expectations, of rules, or of oneself. But before any of that became visible, before the scandals and the headlines, the first cracks appeared quietly, inside a childhood shaped by instability, distance, and loss. Long before fame ever entered the picture, instability had already taken root in Kiefer Sutherland's life. When he was just 3 years old, the ground beneath his family shifted violently. In 1969, his mother, Shirley Douglas, was arrested in Los Angeles, accused of attempting to purchase explosives for the Black Panther Party. The charges would later collapse in court, but the damage was done. Their home was raided by dozens of armed officers. She spent days in jail. Her U.S. work permit was revoked, and she remained under government scrutiny for years. For a child too young to understand politics or ideology, what remained was simpler and more devastating: fear, disruption, and uncertainty. Only a year later, the family fractured again. Shirley Douglas and Donald Sutherland divorced, severing the household into two separate worlds. Kiefer and his twin sister Rachel left Los Angeles with their mother, moving first to smaller towns, then eventually settling in Toronto. Hollywood, the place where his father's name carried weight and power, was suddenly far away. What replaced it was a quieter, leaner life. Shirley raised her children with limited financial resources, rebuilding from the wreckage of political fallout and professional exile. The Sutherland name still existed, but its protection did not. Kiefer changed schools repeatedly, forming friendships only to abandon them again months later. Stability never stayed long enough to become familiar. His father remained a distant presence. Visits were limited to summers or holidays. Years later, Kiefer would admit that he didn't fully grasp how famous his father was until adolescence, when he finally watched his films and realized the magnitude of the man he barely knew. That distance mattered. Children learn identity through proximity, through presence, through consistency. Kiefer grew up without those anchors. Instead, he learned independence early, self-reliance by necessity, and emotional restraint as survival. There was no safety net of routine, no predictable rhythm to hold on to. Yet, woven into this fractured upbringing was a constant contradiction. At home, life was modest. In the world, his name opened doors he didn't live inside. He heard stories about his grandfather changing Canada's future while watching his mother struggle to rebuild hers. He carried a famous surname, yet lived like someone who could not rely on it. This contrast shaped something sharp inside him: a quiet hunger, a need to prove himself without asking for help, a resistance to authority paired with a craving for control. These were not traits taught in acting school. They were forged in childhood through displacement, absence, and unresolved tension. So when Kiefer Sutherland eventually stepped toward acting, it wasn't simply ambition pulling him forward, it was escape. Acting offered structure, purpose, a place where chaos could be rehearsed, controlled, and released on cue. On screen, emotions made sense. Off screen, they did not. The irony is painful in hindsight. The profession that gave him focus would later magnify every unresolved fracture beneath the surface. Because before the world ever labeled him intense, dangerous, or volatile, he was simply a boy who grew up learning that nothing lasts, and that control, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. By the time Kiefer Sutherland reached his mid-teens, the path ahead felt clearer than the life he was living. School offered structure, but not purpose. Home offered safety, but not certainty. Acting, on the other hand, offered something he had never truly experienced before: control. At 15, he made a decision that would alarm most families. He dropped out of school to pursue acting full-time. There was no guarantee of success, no safety net waiting beneath him. What he did have was a quiet confidence forged by years of instability. Risk no longer frightened him. Uncertainty was familiar territory. His first notable screen appearance came in Max Duggan Returns, where he acted alongside his father for one of the only times in their careers. The moment was symbolic more than transformative, a brief intersection between two lives that had largely moved in parallel rather than together. On set, Kiefer was observing not just performance, but power, how actors occupied space, how authority was conveyed without explanation. Then came the Bay Boy. The role changed everything. At just 18, his performance carried a rawness that critics immediately noticed. There was anger in it, but also restraint, pain, but not chaos. The film earned him a Genie Award nomination and, more importantly, confirmed that his instincts were real. Dropping out had not been reckless, it had been decisive. What followed was a string of roles that seemed uncannily aligned with his inner landscape. In Stand By Me, he played Ace Merrill, a character built on menace rather than volume. He didn't need many lines. His presence alone shifted the tone of every scene. At 17, Sutherland understood something many actors never fully grasp. Fear is often quieter than rage. A year later, The Lost Boys amplified that image. As David, the vampire leader, he spoke sparingly, moved deliberately, and radiated authority. Critics praised his ability to dominate the frame without theatrics. Audiences remembered him even when he wasn't speaking. On screen, Kiefer Sutherland had discovered something vital. He could channel chaos into precision. He could turn internal tension into presence. He could control emotion rather than be consumed by it. Directors noticed, casting agents noticed, Hollywood noticed. His rise continued with Young Guns, where he held his own among a generation of rising stars. The industry began to see him as dependable, intense, and commercially valuable. The troubled energy that had once been a private burden was now an asset. But there was a quiet irony embedded in this ascent. The screen rewarded the very qualities that life had left unresolved. Intensity became marketable, volatility became charisma, silence became strength. Acting gave him a place to stand, but it did not heal what lay beneath, it refined it. By the end of the 1980s, Kiefer Sutherland was no longer just the son of a legend or the product of a famous name. He was a star in his own right, defined by edge, danger, and emotional gravity. And as Hollywood celebrated the fire he brought to the screen, few stopped to wonder what would happen if that fire ever escaped the frame. By the time the new millennium arrived, Kiefer Sutherland had already proven himself as a powerful screen presence. But nothing in his earlier career, not the cult classics, not the critical praise, prepared Hollywood for what came next. In 2001, a television series changed everything. 24 did not simply make Sutherland famous, it redefined his identity. As Jack Bauer, he embodied relentless control in a world collapsing by the hour. The character was decisive, ruthless when necessary, emotionally sealed shut. He absorbed pressure without hesitation and made impossible choices without visible doubt. Week after week, audiences watched Bauer endure scenarios that would break most people and keep going. The performance felt disturbingly authentic. What made 24 revolutionary wasn't just its real-time format, it was the man at its center. Sutherland didn't play a hero in the traditional sense, he played a survivor, a man who carried violence, guilt, and sacrifice as tools rather than burdens. And the world responded. Ratings soared. The show became a global phenomenon, reaching tens of millions of viewers worldwide. Awards followed quickly, an Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series, a Golden Globe, multiple Screen Actors Guild Awards. By the mid-2000s, Sutherland was no longer just respected, he was indispensable. Hollywood rewarded him accordingly. In 2006, he signed a reported $40 million contract with Fox Television, making him one of the highest-paid actors in television history. The deal gave him more than money, it gave him power, executive producer status, creative influence, and his own production space on the Fox lot. For the first time, he wasn't just carrying the story, he was shaping it. From the outside, it looked like total victory. But beneath the surface, something darker was happening. As Jack Bauer became synonymous with endurance and moral extremity, the line between character and performer began to blur. The traits that once set Sutherland apart, intensity, emotional suppression, a comfort with darkness, were no longer treated as warning signs. They were celebrated, marketed, protected. The system had made a choice. As long as the work delivered, the rest could be managed. During this period, legal issues quietly accumulated in the background. Alcohol-related arrests and probationary sentences were handled with discretion, often framed as isolated missteps rather than parts of a larger pattern. Public relations smoothed the edges, headlines softened, consequences were delayed. Hollywood had learned a familiar lesson. Fire is dangerous, but profitable. And when something is profitable, institutions rarely ask where it comes from or what it costs. 24 itself became controversial, particularly for its repeated depictions of torture and moral absolutism. Military officials later raised concerns that the show blurred ethical lines for real-world audiences. Sutherland publicly dismissed the criticism, defending the series as fiction. Yet the debate revealed something important. The character's worldview had bled into cultural consciousness. Jack Bauer was celebrated for doing whatever it took. So was the system that kept rewarding the man who played him. By the end of the show's peak years, Kiefer Sutherland stood at the highest point of his career, wealthy, powerful, acclaimed, and seemingly untouchable. But success did not interrupt the internal struggle. It concealed it. And the more Hollywood reinforced the image of control, the less space there was to confront what remained unresolved beneath it. The fire that fueled his performances had been given oxygen, not boundaries. Eventually, it would look for a way out. At a certain point, isolated incidents stop looking isolated. For Kiefer Sutherland, the warning signs had been present for years, quietly stacking on top of one another, while success kept the spotlight fixed elsewhere. What Hollywood framed as bad nights or temporary lapses began to form something harder to dismiss, a pattern. The first arrest came in 1989, late at night, alcohol involved, a traffic stop that revealed far more than reckless driving. The charges were negotiated down, the consequences softened. At the time, his career was still ascending, and the industry had no reason to slow its momentum. Then it happened again. In 1993, another DUI. Different year, same circumstances. The response followed a familiar script: community service, fines, promises of change. The story faded, his work continued. The machine moved forward. By the early 2000s, Sutherland was no longer just a rising actor. He was the face of a global television phenomenon. That status mattered. When another DUI arrest surfaced in 2004, it was handled quietly. Probation, mandatory treatment, controlled messaging. Public apologies that felt rehearsed rather than examined. The system had become efficient at containing damage, but containment is not the same as correction. In 2007, while still on probation, Sutherland was arrested yet again after failing a sobriety test. This time, the consequences were unavoidable. He served more than 40 days in jail, a rare moment when celebrity could not fully shield him. Cameras followed his arrival, headlines were sharper. For a brief moment, it looked like a breaking point. Yet even that didn't end the cycle. 2 years later, in 2009, the pattern shifted from private to public. At a Met Gala after-party, one of the most controlled, image-conscious environments in entertainment, Sutherland allegedly headbutted a fashion designer after a minor altercation. Blood was drawn, witnesses were stunned. The story spread before dawn. The incident was later resolved privately. Charges were dropped, apologies were exchanged, and once again, the narrative softened. What tied these moments together wasn't just alcohol or aggression, it was timing, pressure, environments saturated with expectation and ego, late nights where restraint had to compete with exhaustion and impulse. Hollywood often romanticizes the troubled genius, but this wasn't chaos in pursuit of art, it was repetition without resolution. Each time the response followed the same arc: shock, damage control, temporary accountability, return to normal. And each time the underlying question remained unanswered. Was anyone actually asking why this kept happening? Or was the industry too invested in the image of control to confront the cost of maintaining it? By the time another DUI arrest surfaced in 2020, more than 30 decades after the first, the story felt disturbingly familiar. Different decade, same mistakes, same explanations. What had once been dismissed as youthful excess had hardened into something else entirely. A man who could portray absolute composure on screen, a system that rewarded it without hesitation, and a private life that kept collapsing under the same unresolved weight. Patterns don't announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves slowly, through repetition, through the refusal to change course. And by now, the question was no longer whether Kiefer Sutherland had struggled. The question was whether anyone, including himself, was ever truly prepared to stop the pattern once it became profitable to ignore it. There comes a moment when even a familiar narrative begins to lose its power. For decades, Hollywood had explained away the chaos surrounding Kiefer Sutherland with a set of well-worn phrases: stress, pressure, exhaustion, the price of fame. Each incident was treated as an exception, unfortunate, regrettable, but ultimately survivable. The work was strong, the audience remained loyal, the machine kept moving. But the latest incident landed differently. Late at night, near one of the most recognizable intersections in Los Angeles, a rideshare driver allegedly fled his own vehicle in fear. According to police reports, Sutherland was arrested on suspicion of making criminal threats after an altercation during the ride. No injuries were reported, no dramatic confrontation unfolded on camera, and yet the image lingered. Someone running, abandoning a car, choosing uncertainty over staying put. It wasn't spectacle that made the story unsettling, it was simplicity. No red carpet, no party, no carefully managed environment, just a private moment spilling into public consequence. By this point, context mattered. This wasn't a first offense, or even a second. It followed decades of documented struggles, arrests, apologies, and attempts at rehabilitation. The timeline no longer allowed for the comfort of surprise. What once felt like isolated chapters now read like the continuation of a single unresolved story. Public reaction shifted. There was less indulgence, less humor, less willingness to separate the art from the pattern behind it. Online discussions no longer centered on what went wrong this time, but on why nothing ever seemed to change. The tone hardened, not toward condemnation, but toward fatigue, a sense that the explanation had been exhausted. This was no longer about a bad night. It was about the slow erosion of trust between a public figure and an audience that had spent years forgiving him because his talent felt worth the effort. At the same time, the industry landscape had changed. Hollywood had grown less tolerant of repeated misbehavior, less patient with figures whose volatility no longer translated into box office security. The protection that once came with indispensability had weakened. And for the first time, the past arrived all at once. Old headlines resurfaced, old footage was replayed, old defenses sounded hollow. The tragedy here isn't simply the possibility of legal consequences. It's the realization that a man who spent his career portraying control may have lost the ability to convince anyone, including himself, that he still possesses it. Fame can delay reckoning. Success can disguise deterioration, but neither can stop time. At some point, the narrative flips. The same history that once softened public judgment becomes the very reason forgiveness runs out. What once was explained away becomes evidence. What was once ignored becomes impossible to overlook. And when that happens, the fall isn't sudden. It's quiet. It's cumulative. It's the moment when excuses stop working, not because they were false, but because they've been used too many times. In the end, the legacy of Kiefer Sutherland resists simple judgment. He is not a cautionary tale in the traditional sense. His career did not collapse overnight. His talent never disappeared. He delivered performances that shaped a generation of television and redefined what audiences expected from dramatic storytelling. For many viewers, his work still carries power, discipline, and emotional truth. And yet, legacies are not built on achievements alone. They are shaped by what remains unresolved. Sutherland's story is not about a lack of opportunity, guidance, or second chances. He had all of them, repeatedly. It is about a man who learned early how to survive instability, but never fully learned how to live without it. The traits that once protected him, intensity, emotional restraint, a willingness to endure pain in silence, eventually became liabilities when left unexamined. On screen, he played men who absorbed violence so others wouldn't have to. Men who carried impossible burdens without complaint. Men who believed control was the same thing as strength. Off-screen, that philosophy exacted a cost. Because control without release becomes pressure. Pressure without reflection becomes repetition. And repetition over time becomes identity. There is a quiet tragedy in realizing that someone capable of portraying moral complexity so convincingly may have struggled to extend that same understanding toward himself. Not because he lacked insight, but because insight alone is not enough to break a pattern that has been reinforced by success, forgiveness, and silence. Hollywood often celebrates resilience, but it rarely asks what resilience is protecting or what it is preventing someone from confronting. Kiefer Sutherland's legacy exists in that tension. He will be remembered as a formidable actor, a defining presence, a man who gave audiences unforgettable characters. But he will also be remembered as someone whose private battles were never fully resolved, only postponed. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the system did not fail him by pushing too hard. It failed him by not pushing back soon enough. And in that sense, his story is larger than one man. It is about what happens when talent is rewarded without accountability, when warning signs are reframed as personality, and when the illusion of control becomes more valuable than the work of healing. Because some wars are loud, public, and cinematic, and some are quiet, fought alone night after night, until even victory on screen can no longer hide the damage underneath. The story of Kiefer Sutherland leaves us with an uncomfortable question, one Hollywood rarely asks out loud. How many warning signs does it take before talent stops protecting someone? Because fame doesn't erase patterns, success doesn't heal wounds, and applause can be the loudest way to drown out a problem that's asking to be faced. Beyond the red carpets, the awards, and the iconic roles, this story isn't about condemnation, it's about recognition, about noticing when brilliance and breakdown start to coexist for too long, and asking who benefits from looking away. Was this a personal tragedy unfolding in public, or a system that learned to reward intensity without responsibility? That answer doesn't belong to Hollywood alone. It belongs to everyone who keeps watching. If this story made you question the image you thought you knew, share your thoughts below. Subscribe to Beyond the Red Carpet for more untold stories hiding behind fame, power, and silence. Because sometimes the most revealing truths aren't found on stage. They're found after the spotlight fades.